Good? Better? Awesome. Sweet, sweet, sweet. I think it was because, okay, so it's like a presenter window. So it's kind of different on my end than yours. So hopefully this works better now. Still good? Everybody's okay? Sweet. Okay. So we're going to talk about response ideologies that personally, like in our work, has helped us when we were dealing with COVID-19. How we thought about solutions was a little bit different than some of our counterparts. And so we were able to respond a bit more effectively in certain situations. What is the necessity behind equitable solutions? How do we think about them? How do we design them in our work? If you are a workforce development professional or part of a workforce development nonprofit or organization, we're going to talk about how we transitioned our education and workforce efforts to support the systems change that was taking place. And then we're going to open it up for discussion for the young adults in the room or for the potential change makers in the room for how you can impact your communities, how you can think about equity and crisis so that you can affect your communities at large. So we're going to kick off our first poll right now. Michaela's going to hit you in the chat with the link and the question behind it. But essentially, I'm asking, when did you personally first start to begin to take COVID-19, the threat of it, seriously? We have a few options here. December is when I believe the first reports in New York were coming out about COVID cases. And then we have January, obviously, February, when there were starting to be questions with at the White House. March, when the shutdown took place, April, post-shutdown, and then we have the oh no era, which is post-April. So go ahead, we have a few seconds to fill that out. If you should see the link in the chat. So go ahead and take a look at that link. And again, just kind of reflect on you personally and thinking back, when did it start to become clear that this is something that would change how your behaviors would be done, how you might interact with folks, what your job prospects might be, all those things. When did you start to personally take COVID-19 seriously? And so we're going to give it a few seconds here. But essentially, I really just want folks to kind of reflect on how serious it was for them, because especially in my community and my family, there definitely was a resistance to even recognize how legitimate a threat this was to their own personal health and to our communities as a whole. All right, so we're gonna give it like, let's say 10 more seconds to fill out, and then we can close out that poll. And Michaela's gonna share some of the top responses in the chat. Or the top response in the chat for us. And all right, let's go ahead and close out that poll. Essentially, why I wanted to bring up this question to you guys is because when we decide to kind of delay reacting to a poll, to wait until, like we said, most of people responded in March, and March was when the shutdown took place. And so by that point, we had an influx of cases, we had a lot of deaths in New York City, and we had a system that was actively choosing to respond to convenient measures and to the answers that were convenient to them. If it's inconvenient to let people or make people stay home for 2 weeks, give them food and money and resources to be able to stay home, we will not do that. We will make sure that we stimulate the stock market. And people really rallied behind that because they believed, as much as we kind of say and maybe have noticed in 2020 a lot more, that a lot of our institutions are not super reliable, there was still a dependent factor when it comes to our government systems, when it comes to our institutional responses. So the stock market became a priority. School systems were not a priority. We clearly saw workforce dollars and training dollars being completely abandoned. And we're making a little joke here, and please use the Chernobyl example. Please look at all types of examples in history where we've had a major crisis that affects people on a global scale, and we have actively denied or avoided that truth because it was really hard to understand, number one, what it means for everyone involved and how much liability there is, what it means to have to respond to it at the scale that's needed and how much of a sacrifice that would be, but more so how inconvenient it just is to have a global crisis. Gosh, I don't want to deal with this right now. I just don't want to deal with it. I'll take a vitamin, I'll be fine. What I heard a lot from the institutions that we worked with when at this stage, where in March, when it was very clear that there were the first death that happened in New York City was right after I came back from vacation. And as soon as I saw that, it became real for me. And that was, I believe, like probably the first week of March or the first day in March. And so that was the point where I went into the office. I was asking around, like, guys, are we still coming into the office? Is this still the case? And when I came in, there were folks that were actively sick with, I'm assuming the flu or like some type of a cold, but were not calling out. And so that was the moment that it hit me that, and they were all, everyone in the office was basically saying, what the schools do, will do. If the schools shut down, we'll shut down. If CUNY shuts down, we'll shut down. And so it was very clear that there was no personal kind of proactive measure among people to change their behaviors early on. So I was very clear that this was going to be a big threat. But let's think further back than March. The reason why I say that is that there were signs prior to December, when we first heard about COVID, probably in the news, that this was an issue that we were going to have to deal with, period. And the reason why I say that is, like, you can take an example like for example, Theranos. So when prior to COVID-19 and prior to hearing about all these different issues that we were going to face because of COVID, there were hackathons constantly popping up for a crisis response. I don't know if anyone noticed, but there were millions of dollars being poured in from Verizon and from Google and various different companies into regular people like you and I trying to design systems change solutions, or even just crisis response solutions for things like the climate crisis, for biological threats, for a hack of the government systems, all type of different global response needed crises. And there were hackathons being created for this. So that was red flag number one. No one's throwing in millions of dollars into a contest to solve a crisis unless you do not know how to solve a crisis and it's coming. So that's number one. Number two, when you look at something like Theranos, huge scam, huge fraudulent kind of scenario that took place, but there's a reason that it took place. There was an agenda on a global level among tech companies, among world leaders, among philanthropists, to invest in biotech that would detect diseases early. And it was, even if you watch the films that are recounting what happened with Theranos, you're seeing that she was reeling in billions in investment for a reason, because a bio threat was one of the biggest things that the world knew was going to come and was going to be a disaster for us. So, so looking at something like that again, then reading into it and deciding, like, okay, so who's on the front lines of investigating this kind of work, and how are we investigating this kind of stuff? And then seeing that, you know, Bill Gates and his institution were putting out papers and, you know, ringing alarm bells for months and years that this would happen, and previous administrations were putting out plans about it. And so there was a lot of reasons for us to anticipate that this would be something we would someday have to deal with. And someday could be 5 years, could be 2 years, whatever the case is. But either way, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because just like we saw in COVID, just like we'll see with the climate crisis, I'm assuming, and with the equity crisis even, there's a phrase that popped up during COVID that I'm sure was being said prior to, but when white people catch a cold, Black people get pneumonia. If you take that phrase and tie it instead to whoever lacks equity, whoever is in impoverished communities, whoever is in poverty in that moment, we still have the same ties. When the rich have a cold, the poor get pneumonia. It is as simple as that. And so if we understand that any threat of a cold needs to be taken seriously by our communities, we need to be watchdogs for our communities to anticipate issues like these and to get ahead of it, and to say, if there are billions of dollars that we're seeing and the money is flowing into investments for biohazards and gene editing and all types of other solutions to be able to detect and address pandemics early on, why are we not still preparing our communities for that? Why are we not finding out what our detection systems for viruses and diseases are? Why are we not anticipating these things and having the same signals coming into our community-based institutions, so that the moment that something is triggered, like a new biohazard or lots of cases of a new virus that has evolved, that we are the first ones to say, before the school system decides to respond, let us respond. Let us go virtual. Let us encourage our communities to start building up food pantry kind of resources, community resources for COVID, or for a COVID-like situation. But the reason behind this, and this is really where I think we ourselves have to face certain truths, is that historically, our country and a lot of other places, even with the Chernobyl example, We've engaged in historical negationism. We have denied any history that is not, like I said, convenient for us. Anyone that is gonna recognize us as sort of the bad guy in a situation. And what I mean by bad guy in this situation is if we have a biological threat, if we have a systemically racist system, if we have an inequitable system that we know will amplify any of the hazardous potential threats to it, if we understand that and we just deny it, that's just our history, is to deny it. When we see a threat like COVID-19, we know who it will affect. And we know that we've denied them those resources like healthcare or basic income or just basic resources like food or housing. We know we've denied them these things. And so how can we respond to those things if we've been in denial about the problems, the systemic problems behind them for so long? And so understanding all of this, the reason why I say all this is because for the people in the room, whether you are a young adult, whether you are part of an institution, whether you are in a nonprofit or going through a training program, I want you to be clear that when systems are failing, because of how our rugged individualism works, people will look out for themselves. And what I ultimately need us to get is that all of us are interconnected. All of these systems are interconnected. So if our neighbor is sick, we will get sick. If our neighbor is struggling, we will struggle. If our neighbor is hungry, we will go hungry. And so as much as this doesn't seem like they're interconnected, COVID should be the best example of how interconnected things are. Our stock market will be affected, our food prices will be affected, our supply chains will be affected, all types of things. So understanding this history is why I'm bringing us to our first point before we move on to our second poll, which is that people don't like inconvenient truths. They do not. And we can look in the mirror and we can say this about ourselves too. This needs to be the first thing that we change in response to this crisis. I have not seen enough of it. I feel like I've had to, in a lot of situations, be the detractor in the room of what seems like kind of bottleneck solutions. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being that person that has to speak an inconvenient truth. And I want you all as young adults or as folks that have agency in these institutions to embrace being that person. And I'm going to tell you why in a moment, why it's going to be rewarding for you and for your community. But you do need to be that person that is speaking about inconvenient truths, regardless if people want to hear it. They need to. They need to hear prior to March 15th, when the shutdown took place, that you have a prerogative to not bring your young adults into a convening, regardless if the schools haven't shut down yet. You have a prerogative to not do that because they're not getting paid for that meeting and they're not gaining much out of it other than giving you legitimacy. So if that is the case, then we have to put them first. We have to face that inconvenient truth that we have a big change coming before that change is sprung upon us. And so we definitely, at least on our end, saw this with food insecurity in 2017 and with the climate crisis, and ringing the bells that basically there is such an inequity in the system that regardless of how great the solutions are, if we can't access them as the communities that are affected by food insecurity, then we're going to continue to have a food crisis and spend billions of dollars not trying to solve it for years. And even at that time, there were people that were denying that there was a food security crisis. And so it's very clear that if there are things that are inconvenient for us to face, that we won't. And so we need to be the first parts of that change. We need to adopt that mentality for ourselves, so we are not going to be in denial about things that are uncomfortable, even if it forces us into new territory that we've decided we don't want to do yet, right? We have to take that on because it will be sprung upon us. So that brings us to our second poll. So Michaela's going to hit us in the chat for that. And a second poll is essentially if you are a young adult that's going through a training program, or you are a young adult that's in school currently, or you are part of an organization like a nonprofit or a college yourself, when did you first start to see COVID responses taking place? When did you start to see remote work being made a priority? When did you start to see resources coming into your neighborhood or your home or your programs for COVID-19? When did the institutions essentially that you work with or thrive with begin to first respond to COVID? And again, we're going to give it a few seconds to kind of respond to that. And while we wait, actually, does anybody want to just share some thoughts on our first poll and any reasons why they might have waited until March to take the pandemic seriously? Feel free to unmute. Anybody? Who's going to volunteer as tribute? Anybody volunteering as tribute?
Well, while people are waiting, we did have a question in the chat from James asking what the image of the previous slide was that we were looking at.
Yep. So this is actually the memorial for COVID deaths in Washington, I believe, Washington, D.C. And so I think every day someone is going in and just adding flags, and relatives of folks that have lost people to COVID-19 are coming and putting their name on the flags. But to me, this is like, it's such a powerful image to see, as just hundreds of thousands of American lives that were lost to COVID. And if you look at this and then think about on a global scale what this means, that we have millions of lives that were either lost or jeopardized because of COVID-19, that has such a ripple effect. That's millions of people throughout countries that, you know, are dependent on the, you know, sole provider of their household, or just children that are left by themselves. It's just devastating to decide to wait to protect communities from things that we know are going to be harmful, as long as we think it won't affect us. So yeah, I just definitely wanted to provide that image so that folks could see what that looks like at scale. So awesome. Top response is March 2020. So our systems waited until the shutdown for the most part to respond to the COVID crisis. And again, by that point is when the scramble is happening. By that point is when we're really in panic mode. Folks are now stocking up on toilet paper instead of vitamins or food. You know what I mean? So just absolutely insanity by that point. And so we really want to think again differently about our institutions when they're responding. If we know that they're not going to hit the alarm bell until, say, the government does, right? If that's the case, and we know that our government has kind of a priority to protect the stock market, or has a priority to protect its funders, things like that, we need to kind of take care of ourselves. And what that means is, first off, recognizing we're all part of a system that is doing harm, whether we like it or not. If we can first admit that to ourselves, and I think the best way to kind of embrace this fact is watch The Good Place if you haven't already. But essentially, it's that dilemma. It's that if you want to be a moral person in the 21st century, living in America, for example, or any capitalist country, or almost any country at this point, you are largely interdependent on each other, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with being interdependent. We don't know it. We don't acknowledge that often, but we are. And in doing so, we are usually taking place in someone else's harm. For me to get this sweater from H&M at $20, I have to marginalize the worker in another country potentially to do it. For me to be able to have the apartment that I have at a subsidized rate, I might be taking that opportunity from someone else, but I really need it too. It is literally, thank you, Ethan. It is essentially kind of like a crabs in a barrel kind of situation, right? If we recognize that when a crisis hits and prior to a crisis hitting, we really need to understand what is harm reduction and really be aware of that early on. And I think on a superficial level, I think a lot of institutions and individuals were aware that they needed to do less harm. I think that shame on Instagram has been a big driver of harm reduction, which is great. But I don't believe in shame as a longevity tool. I don't. I believe that we need to have empathy and respect for one another enough to recognize how we can do harm. So the biggest thing, and we'll talk through now how we as a workforce institution decided to transition our work prior to COVID, and we're able to do some harm reduction aspects. And again, this is coming back to sacrificing our kind of needs and making sure that we're putting first that anything that we're doing in the space is going to do the least amount of harm as possible. So for us, prior to COVID, we saw how requiring people to be in person was such a big ask of a 21st century employee that we were testing out virtual teams as it was. We were building out virtual team systems as it was. And we were planning in the future to be able to transition to remote work 100%, with the exception of certain days that we're building farms. So because of that, it was a relatively smooth transition. And again, this is coming back to anticipating some of the things that are going to potentially harm our community if something were to happen. If someone has a child, which some of our staff members when we first started did, then that's something that we want to be able to reduce harm, which would be taking them away from their child or requiring that they find babysitters, things like that. So that was one thing. Another thing was deciding that the oversight was not as important as the safety. And so a lot of nonprofits or schools, things like that, government entities really had a really big resistance to accepting remote work because they felt that there was such a lack of oversight. The question then becomes, one, how important is safety to you if the oversight is more important? If that person passes away, you now have a turnover issue. Do I need to explain to you how much that's going to cost you versus training them, So again, when you have to put it into those terms for institutions and make it so that there's a bottom line or a triple bottom line that they need to meet, there's a benefit to them as far as their cost, then we realize that there's kind of an issue. There's a problem with how we're thinking about harm reduction, right? So that's the other thing, is just making sure that we build systems for oversight rather than introduce harm so that we can preserve our systems. That's not what we want to do at all. And then lastly was we considered our population, the barriers to COVID response that they had, and immediately responded. So we already had wellness checks that we were doing on folks as a result of them being completed with the program. And because of that, we knew who was housing insecure, who had immigration status issues, who had potential food insecurity issues, who had a situation at home that would not be conducive to working from home, things like that. So we were able to respond and intervene immediately. And the reason why I'm saying this is because this was in March that this was taking place, that these transitions were taking place. This was not in April or May, as many institutions were. And the reason why we were equipped to do that is because we were anticipating that these kind of things could happen that would require us to work remotely. From there is value adding. So again, once we've done the work of protecting our communities, we made sure that they can stay home. We made sure that they have a livable income. We made sure that they have housing, they have food, they have resources if they need it, mental health resources if they needed it, and a community to turn to talk to. Once we've established that, we needed to have a plan for our institutions, for our work. So this is again for the nonprofits in the room. For us, that meant taking our internship programming, virtualizing it completely, and introducing social emotional practices where we would pick out folks from our team members, highlight what their strengths were every week, really kind of boost them up, take a problem solving kind of mentality to any situation that we were in with them, and really be proactive. We're not going to hide what the issues are. We're not going to hide that there are certain traumas that took place during the quarantine. We're going to face them. We're going to face them together. We're going to be brave about it. We're going to talk about it. And we're going to be proactive about finding solutions. Because if you're just inviting people to speak about their trauma and not inviting solutions for how to address it, you are doing more harm. So again, to the value add, if I'm going to introduce a scenario where you're safe to speak about your trauma, I'm going to ask myself and the folks around me to rally behind you and make sure you don't feel alone in that process. Then from there, we developed an alternative curriculum. So this was end of March, early April that we spent really hardcore developing curriculum. And this was for other institutions. This was not for us. We knew that as an organization that is in its third year or was in its third year at the time, we were not big enough. We didn't have enough staff members, but we did have a really big know-how on technical systems, on project management, on team management remotely, on technical skills. So how do we package that and who do we get it to? Because who needs it most right now? How do we make sure that our school systems don't collapse? How do we make sure that our after school programs don't collapse and all these systems that are really keeping people sane? And so we started to pitch that programming to various institutions in government and in nonprofits. It was a big challenge because of the timing that we offered it to them. Which was early in the pandemic. They really hadn't embraced or understood that the pandemic isn't going to end in 3 weeks. So they did not take advantage of those services, unfortunately. But again, this is for the folks in the room. When a crisis is happening, how can you add value to the system? How do you not just become kind of babysitters in the situation and advocate for something like SYP? How do you ensure that other institutions have a value that they're going to derive from you? So that they can also thrive and we can build a community, because we need that. And then we went into focusing on folks' immediate needs, of course, and we kept on fulfilling that immediate need as long as it was occurring, not just based on whether or not we had funding. And then last thing is the biggest point that we looked at that we felt wasn't necessarily responded to during COVID was future planning. And that's based on scenarios. So again, now this is talking about the climate crisis, for example. if we're hitting a certain number of degrees increased or a certain amount of carbon emissions increased over the next couple of years, then we have a point where we can't turn back, right? We're almost, or if not already at that point with carbon emissions, right? So let me tell you what that looks like for us when it comes to these various scenarios, these best case scenarios, right? Best case scenario, Biden comes in, climate legislation happens, we mobilize behind climate, great. We've built a new industry behind it, it's a Green New Deal. That is a half measure, whether we want to admit that or not. Believe it or not, the Green New Deal is a half measure because ultimately, if communities aren't able to respond to the climate crisis the way that the government is equipped to respond to the climate crisis, we are going to see another iteration of the COVID crisis where we need another mobilization on a rapid global level to be able to respond to something like, for example, a food system collapsing. Being that that's the case, being that we know we're almost at, if not already at the point of no return for carbon emissions, how that influences our mission as an organization is to say, we know that the climate crisis is happening. We're not here to prevent it. We know it's going to come. We know that the people that are going to be affected by the climate crisis at the highest levels won't be affected for at least 20 years, right? Sea level rise is not going to run a rich person out of their home because they are sitting at elevations higher than us. Food prices skyrocketing are not going to affect wealthy people because they can afford it. Workers not being able to work outside because of something like we blotted out the sun in California, that's something that's not going to affect a wealthy person. These are things that are going to affect certain vulnerable communities. So if we know that the bigger consequences of the climate crisis aren't going to come for 20 years to everyone else, how do we ensure that when the climate crisis affects the people we know and our communities and our food systems within the next 5 years, which is what is expected, we will have 5 years. We will have a water issue in terms of like whether or not we have destabilized countries and climate refugees on a massive scale in the next 5 years. If we know this, how do we ensure that we have systems that are going to respond to those communities specifically, not just to a global crisis like the government would? And that brings us to our last poll for the day. And then we're going to open up to Q&A in just a bit if we hopefully have time. I'll make sure we have time. But yeah, so go ahead. We're going to hit you in the chat with the third poll. Describe in one word the government's COVID response. That's how I feel about it. It was a clownish response. But that's just me, you know. We're going to give you a few seconds to respond. And this one's a fun one. Please just go nuts. Like, talk about how you feel. You don't have to censor yourself here. It's okay. No one's going to see this poll but us. You know, it's not going to get shared. But yeah, go nuts, because we don't get to vent enough about how clownish the response was. Anywho, we're going to give it a few seconds. And again, this is once more just to reiterate and reestablish that when a crisis is happening, if we don't feel 100% comfortable about how our systems are responding to it, why are we depending on them? Why are we trusting them? And if, even though it is out of a kind of mutually assured destruction, if 2020 has proven nothing else, there is no mutually assured destruction. There's something called, for example, the Defense Protection Act, which could have been instituted very early on. And could have allowed for folks to be able to stay at home. We could have distributed food. We could have distributed Wi-Fi routers and resources. And there's a lot we could have done by instituting that early on and utilizing that kind of stopgap. And we didn't. We didn't until it was too late. So again, if we understand that these systems will self-preserve before they will protect the communities that we're paying our tax dollars to help them protect, then we have to understand how to build our own system. So let's hit the chat really quick. Let's see what our biggest responses were. 30 seconds left. Okay, we got a few more seconds. We got a few more seconds to fill it out. Do you want to close it out now, Michaela? Different responses. Few examples were irresponsible, inadequate, horrendous. Love it. Awesome. So if this is how you feel about it, let me ask you, like, do you trust them to face the climate crisis for you? Do you trust them for the next 5 years to solve our water scarcity crisis? Do you trust them to build the institutions, the buildings, the waterways, the bridges, the solar panels, the wind pipelines, all of these things, the different energy infrastructure that we need, do you trust them to divest from fossil fuels, invest in clean energy, invest in a workforce, and into a food security solution on a scale that has never been done? Do you trust them? And if the answer is no, then here's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to put self-sufficiency above short-term solutions. And I want you to think about this in various ways. So whether, again, you are a nonprofit that's in the room, or you work with nonprofits, or you're in a college institution, it is now your job. It is all of our jobs to work towards self-sufficiency systems. Whether you are a young adult in the room that's kind of, just learning about this stuff for the first time, whether you're someone that has been very frustrated with how the systems in our life have responded to the crises around us, understanding that self-sufficiency is the biggest tool for being able to survive crises is the biggest answer that I can endorse to you guys. And part of that means that we have to get off of our short-term solutions. That means we have to sacrifice on a larger level in some ways to be able to have better solutions in a crisis. So what does this mean? So give me just kind of throw a 1 into the chat if you are a young adult or an entrepreneur yourself. If you are a young person that wants to start a business someday, or you are a person that just wants to start a business someday, hit me in the chat, hit me with a 1. Yes, 1. No other entrepreneurs? Yes, Michaela, let's go. We got entrepreneurs on the call. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so for my entrepreneur, yes, another one. See, love it. Female entrepreneurs, let's go. If y'all want to talk about it, we can talk about it. Anyways, essentially, think about this. You as an entrepreneur, your priority is to what? Make money, right? You want to have a business that's going to make you some money. Now, what if I were to ask that you were to build a social enterprise as opposed to a for-profit business, like, for example, a makeup line? Your makeup line could produce some income for you in the short term, but ultimately is going to use a lot of resources that are not sustainable. You're going to be sourcing materials from places like Alibaba or Amazon and endorsing kind of a worker system that is disenfranchising of other people. And you're going to be selling things to people that you know who probably would, at least initially, would buy those things from you anyway. So again, thinking about how we want to build our businesses, thinking about how we want to build our enterprises, our systems for self-sufficiency. If we stop thinking about profit as the priority anymore, if we started to think about wellness as the priority, if we started to think about, I can make a decent income, I can be my own boss, I can employ people that I know that need employment, and I can use resources that are good for people. I'm not introducing something negative to people. One thing that we saw with the COVID crisis, for example, was a lot of scams. If you saw the mandalas on Instagram that your friends are trying to get you into, short-term solutions over self-sufficiency any day. So this is the thing, we are stronger together than we are apart. And if that's the case, then how do we look at our food systems, our energy systems, our water systems, all of these things, and start to decide on how we address them? And if there are several people in the room that want to start building self-sufficiency systems for themselves, how are you growing your own food? How are you catching rainwater, for example? How are you looking into home ownership? How are you looking into systems that you can insulate and protect yourself and your community? And how do you work together to do that? Next is anticipating who we need to apply pressure to. So when a crisis happens, it's kind of like an arms race, right? Everyone's grabbing for power, everyone's grabbing for resources, everyone's grabbing for toilet paper, right? So if we know this, we have to anticipate who are the people that we're going to need to apply pressure to at what times. So one example that was really strong was the SYEP push on certain legislative members to make sure that we could protect summer youth employment. For us, on the other hand, though, we were applying pressure to, for example, the folks that we have partnerships with at CYE, and how we had done that, and that made sure that we had SYEP funding for that summer. But essentially, we had to create sort of like an asset map, anticipating that if something were to go wrong in these systems, if we lose SYEP, if we lose these funders, if we lose this and this and this, how do we target specific folks? So this is for, again, the nonprofits in the room, for the young adults in the room that want to invest in systems change. You need to know who your political representatives are. You need to have political representation of your own, meaning that you need people that are endorsing your work. You need people that are that you're sending to Congress, that you're sending to be assemblymen, to be city council members, to be on your community boards. You need those folks that are being sent from your communities, and you need to come and rally behind them. Beyond that, we need to understand who those folks are in a crisis. If the climate crisis is taking place, I know that I need to have the Mayor's Office of Sustainability available on a call so that I can respond to any RFPs that are coming from them. I know that I need to be interacting with EDC, for example, to be able to make sure that if there's an RFP that they're designing, that I can be able to respond to that call as well. So different things like that, understanding what asset mapping is. Who are the folks in your sphere? Who has assets to be able to help you? How do you move those assets as needed? And then lastly, of course, is just thinking forward about these problems and not running from them. Now, my last 2 points before we open up to a few minutes of Q&A is that we've normalized corruption for so long. We've enabled this kind of denialism that we saw in 2020. It is the reason why we were in denial for so long about this crisis, and why we're still in denial about the climate crisis, why we're in denial about food security, about economic security and wellness, about mental health even. We have normalized corruption at every level of our institutions. So of course we can't trust them now to be able to respond to the needs that we have. We can't do that anymore. And that means within ourselves as well. I've seen institutions turning on each other, even in the process of trying to fight for resources post-COVID. And they didn't need to turn on each other. Ironically, they weren't necessarily competing. It was very strange to watch. Like, we end up becoming oppressors in our own ways when we normalize these behaviors, because eventually when things get tough, we look at those who are conducting themselves corruptly or doing things that are kind of shifty, and we decide, well, if they can get away with it, I need to too now. If this is what the normal is, I need to go along with the normal. I can't be the outlier here. And what I'm suggesting is that you're going to come across, especially in American capitalism, especially as an entrepreneur, you're going to come across in situations where you can get away with certain things. And I'm going to ask that you don't. I'm going to ask that you be highly vocal about how you're seeing certain things that are appearing to be corruption, that are appearing to be abuses of power, or another form of denialism, or another form of extractive activity. If we are still extracting ideas from communities and not providing anything back, if we're still not paying folks that are doing our work for us, if we're still not encouraging people and endorsing people to pull, to be able to bring about systems change, we're endorsing ourselves. We're becoming the oppressors as these institutions here. So the gatekeeper mentality needs to go out the window, and we can't keep doing that. And you, as the young adults, if you are in the room that are going to be able to see this when you become change makers yourselves, need to be as hardcore as you've seen in 2020. You need to be that loud. You need to be that vocal. You need to be that combative about it, because it's that serious. It is that serious to hand money to an organization that is not going to put that money into the hands of people that need it. If you are not doing poverty reduction for the sake of eliminating poverty, you are going to guarantee that you as an institution stay. And this brings me to my very last point, which is that without people power, any solution is corruptible. And the reason why I say this is that if you are an organization in the room that is doing poverty reduction or economic mobility or workforce development, your goal ultimately is to solve the problem. Your goal is to not exist someday. If we achieve a food security solution, I want to disappear. And that's a good thing. I should not have to exist in 25 years. And if I have to exist, then something has failed and we need to think differently. So if we start to think about our systems change solutions like those, if we start to approach systems change where the people that are affected by it have a say, where the people that are affected by it have resources, have a community to come to. And I'm going to go a step further with that. We need to have our own media resources so we can disseminate information safely. We need to have our own systems for science and research. We need to have our own STEM labs in our communities that are Black owned, that are person of color owned, or women of color run. We need to have this kind of diversity within our systems, because otherwise you see what's now happening with the vaccine, for example, where the breakdown in trust is so big, we will leave behind our communities that are already dying at disproportional rates. So again, without people power, any solution is corruptible. So when you're seeing people distrusting a system, don't leave them behind, bring them with you to build a new one. That's what I'm going to ask of everyone here. Thank you so much for listening. Let's open it up for Q&A. Yeah, and we did share in the chat just a quick reading resource. So if you're not understanding necessarily what we mean by the equity crisis, is there an equity crisis? What does that mean? What is extractive capitalism? Really short resource, really quick reading material to be able to get versed up on what that means. Thank you, Ethan. But yeah, I realized we didn't get to have too much of a back and forth conversation here, but I really just wanted to go over with you guys how important it really is for us to think differently. Everyone in the room largely feels the same way, that we didn't respond fast enough, that our institutions didn't respond fast enough, and we were dependent on these government systems that ultimately did, like you said, horrendous. So now, understanding all of this, how do we begin to build back? Instead, if for the entrepreneurs in the room, who wants to be the next media mogul for your community? Who wants to build the next STEM lab? Who wants to be the next politician in their community or join their community board? Who wants to influence things at a larger level and bring people with you to do that process? Even if it means sacrificing profit, even if it means sacrificing your own personal agendas or glory, even if it means pissing off everyone in the room and saying that you should keep your students at home in March. Are you going to be that person? Can we be these people together? Can we make it safer for people to be able to do less harm and do more good? Any questions before we wrap up, folks? Feel free to unmute. Thank you, Angelia. All right, y'all. I guess that's the end of our session then. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to pop my email into the chat for you guys really quick, so that if anyone who maybe is a little bit Zoom shy wants to hit me up for some questions, or some further discussion, join equity groups even. There's a few folks that are coalescing in the Bronx and in Brownsville. So again, if this is something that you're passionate about, if you are done dealing with the equity crisis, if you are done trusting these institutions to solve it for you, if you are ready to look at cooperative ownership models, look at CDFIs, look at cryptocurrency solutions, look at how we become the futurists, how we become the pioneers in our institutions so that we don't have to respond to crises late, definitely shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to have a discussion with you, point you to resources, point you to various groups that you can get connected with. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that you guys got a lot out of it. And again, hit me up with any questions. Thank you, Michaela, for moderating. Thank you to the NYC group for having us and giving us so much time to chat your ears off. Thank you, Michaela, for sharing with me. All right, y'all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Please be safe. Let's fight this climate crisis together. Bye, guys.